So over the past few weeks, we interviewed 12 leaders, most of whom were based in Houston, a few outside of Houston, that have perspectives on where the industry is going or needs to go to deeply decarbonized. And the three findings that we kind of summarized to are, first, there's a real clear evidence that there's growing interest and recognition of the opportunities and potential need to deeply decarbonize the Houston industrial sector. Second, that there's almost no way to get to where Houston needs to go if it wants to deeply decarbonize if CCUS is not a big player in that. And then lastly, there was a broad consensus on more needed to be done, but there wasn't consensus on what needed to be done and who needed to do it. So just to give a little bit of color, here are some quotes from some of the interviews that we conducted. 10 years ago, talking about deep decarbonization would have been a short conversation, but there's been an awakening. One interviewee who actually, I won't name who it was, but it is somebody who is in the audience today, has been saying that, been bugging Houston for 2 years to set a goal for zero carbon. Recognition that Houston-based companies are somewhat lagging in this shift relative to other companies in the world, and we heard that earlier today from one of the panelists, effectively. And then lastly, there's a sense that Houston might really get lapped if we don't get started. So there's a window of opportunity here, and hopefully this conversation can be a catalyst for further work and further initiative to keep advancing the deep decarbonization discussion here in Houston. The second point, again, was that CCUS is going to be vital. And we heard it earlier today, again, from one of the panelists. If CCUS can't be made to work in Houston, it's not going to work anywhere. So, and although it's not listed here as one of the quotes, one of the things we heard is, and we heard it today, this morning, from Andy Steinhubel, I see Andy out there, that one opportunity for Houston is to become a hub for carbon capture and sequestration technologies and activity. Because, to the last bullet point, the storage resource here along the Gulf, outside in the Gulf, is really well understood and very, very large. And so you actually could become to carbon sequestration what the Permian is to conventional oil production. And then lastly, ambiguity, how to proceed. There's a lot going on, but how can we improve our coordination? One person said, yeah, I know more needs to be done, but I can't figure out what it is that needs to be done. And then a challenge that was recognized is that a lot of the information that would be helpful to figuring out how to proceed and in what way to proceed is going to be held by individual companies and who are necessarily going to be really, really protective about sharing that information. So that's going to challenge or complicate any activities that we might think about to move forward on deep decarbonization. Nevertheless, given the overall sentiment that we should do more, we'll have to figure out a way to work around that. So with that as sort of prefatory remarks, I'd like to introduce our four panelists. Their bios are in the packets that are on in front of your table there. But we're going to have Jeanne-Mey Sun from Baker-Hughes talk about opportunities for carbon emission reductions in the upstream phase of oil and gas, and including showing how Baker-Hughes is driving down a very significant decarbonization goal. Cate Hight from Rocky Mountain Institute is going to talk about fugitive methane emissions and what can be done to reduce those. As Amory said at lunchtime, that's an imperative near-term opportunity to really change the trajectory of the carbon dioxide or the GHG threat that we face. Tracy Hester from the law school at the University of Houston is going to be talking about CCUS and a lot of the work that he's been involved with to advance that ball or set of balls. And then lastly, Greg Bean from the Bauer College of Business at University of Houston We'll talk about the role of hydrogen. I think everyone recognizes that hydrogen has an important role to play, but what that role is and how it fits in is a little bit unclear. So with that, I will first turn it over to Jeanne-Mey, and I will forward through to your slides.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. And good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to be here. The title of this session is Roadmap to Zero Carbon in Oil and Gas, and it's a very appropriate title because we at Baker-Hughes are actually striving to reach that objective, and we've set ourselves the goal of being net zero by 2050, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, we did do quite a bit of work to just frame the situation, and these aren't Houston-centric slides, these are our global slides. So starting out, the first thing we did was just quantify what are the greenhouse gas emissions annually around the globe, and it's about 51 gigatons or 51 billion tons a year as of 2017. The oil and gas industry, which is defined as up, mid, and downstream, is about 9% of that total, or about 4.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. We then looked more deeply at the oil and gas value chain, and you can see on this slide that upstream is about 62% of the total. Midstream is about 7%, downstream about 31%. Within the upstream, the single biggest category is called processing, which really relates to things like oil, gas, and water separation, associated gas venting and flaring, and water treatment, among other activities. We then took one more step and looked at different types of recovery methods. And as you would expect, primary recovery is the least emissive, followed by secondary recovery, and then lastly by tertiary recovery. In addition, for any given recovery method, onshore is more emissive than offshore because of the land disturbance element of it. And again, within those different recovery methods, we did look at the activities themselves, and you can see at the bottom left, production combustion, processing combustion, and processing venting, flaring, and fugitives are the three biggest activity categories. We then looked geographically across the world, and we've also done this work at a field level. And you can see there's a very big variation in carbon intensity across the world, which is highly aligned with the types of recovery methods that are used in those parts of the world. So at the far left, the least carbon intensive Saudi Arabia, you can see, is quite low. At the far right, countries like Venezuela, who produce a lot of heavy oil, that's a very emissive activity or carbon intensive activity. So with that framing in mind, we then asked ourselves as Baker-Hughes, what can we do? And we announced what we're calling Energy Forward strategy. We announced that in late January at our annual meeting in Florence. And it's a three-part strategy. It's basically to become carbon neutral or net zero from a carbon footprint standpoint by 2050, which is aligned with the 1.5-degree scenario of the Paris Climate Accords. The left side relates to our footprint. So we're basically saying we're going to eliminate our carbon footprint by 2050, and we have interim goals in between with a 50% reduction by 2030. The center portion, or the second pillar, is to be a net zero partner to our customers. So we really want to help our customers, who are the oil and gas operators, reduce their carbon footprints as they're extracting and producing and refining oil and gas. And then lastly, we want to expand into new energy areas as well. We are reducing our footprint across all three of the so-called emission scopes, which for people in the room that are in this space know that there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I won't go into that, but we are reducing our emissions across the board. And if we look at our internal efforts, they really focus around converting to more renewables-generated electricity, implementing energy efficiency projects around the company, and optimizing our supply chain and logistics. I mentioned that we're looking at all 3 emissions scopes, and in particular, we're looking at life cycle analysis of key parts of our portfolio. We're very concerned about the emissions from the use of our products and services by our customers, and so we've embarked on doing that work specifically. And so from that standpoint, there's a number of levers that we're looking at, things like substituting to less emissive energy sources, so from diesel to natural gas to renewables, improving our efficiency, which we've been doing all along. That's a key message of the downturn in these past few years. We've improved our efficiency, and along with that comes a reduction in time and in energy use and in emissions as a result. We are redesigning our tools and equipment so that they use less emissive materials all the way up in the supply chain. We are developing carbon capture use and storage technologies. And we are doing things like improving reliability of our products and services to reduce the need for well interventions, extending the life of our wells so that you don't have to drill as many wells, and that's in itself an emissive reduction, and then doing effective plug and abandonment and decommissioning. We have a number of technologies already that are in the market. These are a few that are available today. So we've got our integrated compressor line, Flare IQ, which is a flare optimization tool and software for the downstream, a suite of gas turbines, which are more efficient than their predecessors, Lumen, which is both a stationary and a drone-based technology for detecting methane emissions. And we've got zero bleed valve systems, which help with the venting issues that I mentioned previously. And then we've also got solutions that help to capture associated gas and monetize that gas and effectively eliminate the flaring as well. And then in development, we've got several CO2 capture technologies in the works, as well as a 100% hydrogen turbine that we're developing. So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer questions later.
Great. Thank you, thank you, Jeanne-Mey. Now, Cate Hight from Rocky Mountain Institute talked a little bit about fugitive methane emissions as we've gotten here, but you can go deeper on that topic, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back in Texas. I'm from Dallas originally, so it's always nice to come back to my native state. So methane. So I think that Amory teed it up nicely in the keynote today, talking about greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 in particular being sort of a cardiovascular disease, and methane being a bleeding artery. And the opportunity that comes with abating methane is some pretty big climate wins in the near term, and being able to keep those very powerful greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. So as we all know, methane is the primary component of natural gas. And methane and associated leaks and process emissions are really something that the natural gas industry needs to make a priority in addressing. I think that we all sort of think about natural gas, and the messaging around natural gas has been that natural gas is better than coal. It's going to be a bridge fuel on the way to a renewable energy economy, and that potential is certainly there, but that potential can only be realized by addressing the methane emissions. And this message is coming not only from environmental groups and from regulators, but it's also coming from the oil and gas companies themselves, many of whom we've heard from today, who are talking about how they're taking some pretty extraordinary concrete steps to address their methane emissions. There's a number of groups out there who've committed to methane reduction goals along the oil and gas value stream, including One Future, OGCI, Methane Guiding Principles, EPA's Methane Challenge Program. And the OGCI companies have announced that they're going to strive for a 0.2% methane leak rate by 2025, which I think is pretty ambitious, but also very achievable. So it's nice to see that the industry is really moving in this direction and making some public announcements about how they're planning to address their emissions.
Can I interrupt just for
Yeah.
1 second? What's the leak rate today? You say they want to get to 0.2% by 2025. What is it today?
It depends on the operator, of course, right? I think that some of them are around 1%, 2%.
Okay.
Yep. So those are pretty extraordinary objectives they have. So in terms of how RMI thinks about this problem, I think there's sort of two questions that come to mind. So first is, how do we track progress in abating methane? There's a number of companies who've committed to these goals. How do we make sure that they're actually achieving what they say they're achieving? And then how do we incentivize additional actors to take action? And we have sort of a perspective that there are two things that are really key to that transition. The first piece of it is really reliable data. We're working right now to stand up the first of its kind methane emissions data platform to really bring clarity to the global emissions landscape. There's a lot of information out there right now that the companies themselves collect, that methane data scientists are collecting, that a number of satellites are out there collecting. And there are a lot of mixed messages about who's emitting what and where it is. We are striving to bring all that information together under one platform, so it'll be easy to visualize where the big methane emissions are coming from and to really take advantage of those opportunities to reduce emissions. Amory alluded to how the methane emissions problem is a really big opportunity for entrepreneurs, and that's true. I mean, this is wasted product, right? So anytime you see a flare, that's wasted product going up. Anytime you see a big leak, that's wasted product. So there is a really big opportunity there to make money from some of these mitigation activities. In terms of the data platform, we're planning on focusing sort of a use case for it that is focused primarily to begin with on the Permian Basin, to really get a good handle on what's happening in the Permian and how we can partner with companies there to take action. In the near term, the objective of this platform is going to be to identify the priority areas of action on methane. And the long term, we're really hoping to help companies be able to demonstrate the progress they're making toward achieving their reduction goals. And also, and I'll speak about this in a moment, sort of opening up what we like to call a market for low emissions natural gas. The vision is that eventually this platform is going to be a self-sustaining tool that's going to be supported by its key customers, who are the oil and gas companies themselves. So that's the first item, is data. So the second item is market. So let me talk a little bit more about that piece of the equation here. RMI really believes about the power of markets to bring about transformative change. Pairing buyers and producers of more sustainable energy is really the key to changing the energy landscape. RMI has years of experience with the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, which has moved hundreds of megawatts of renewable energy onto the grid by partnering big green electricity buyers like the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world with renewable energy developers. And we're hoping to do that same sort of effort for a market for low emissions gas. So partnering some of these big utilities that produce power, that distribute natural gas, some of the big manufacturers that use natural gas as a direct input, with producers who can demonstrate that they're producing low emissions gas. We recognize that natural gas is going to have to be a key part of the solution for each of these buyers. Certainly, there's going to be some biogas involved in there. Renewable natural gas is a really hot topic, and a lot of buyers are very interested in that right now. Right now, there's not enough supply to meet the demand for it. And hydrogen is certainly in the pipeline, but it's really sort of a future-looking fuel still at the moment. So natural gas, low emissions natural gas specifically, is really going to need to be part of the solution here. So at the end of last year, you guys may have heard about the first transaction for responsible gas, which took place between Southwestern Energy and a utility in New Jersey called New Jersey Resources. This was a fairly groundbreaking transaction that certified this gas as being not only low emissions, but also water responsible and chemical responsible. There are a number of these transactions that are sort of in the works right now in Canada and in the US as well, and we're really hoping at RMI to build on this momentum by bringing together the demanders of natural gas with suppliers who are interested in demonstrating that they're reducing methane emissions along their value chain. We think probably that at the start, this market is going to be sort of a bilateral market where there'll be transactions that'll go directly from a producer to a purchaser, maybe even connected via pipeline. But over time, we would really like to try to use this data platform that we're developing to support a market that can be much more wide-ranging. So I guess sort of in conclusion, methane is a really big challenge and it's a really big opportunity. One of the best pieces of the news about methane is that we have the tools on hand to address it today. We, in general, right now know where the big leak events are happening. As we get more and more granular data that can take us down to the facility level, it's going to get easier and easier for operators to identify where they need to take action and hopefully save some money on their leak detection and repair program campaigns so that they can really target the areas where they need to focus on. We're really committed to working with operators to figure this out, right? This is something that we want to make sure that everyone has the data they need, everyone understands the tools that are available to address the problem, and that we can really work with operators and the buyers of the commodity to stand up this market for low emissions gas.
Great. Thank you very much, Cate. And now, Tracy, Hester from the University of Houston.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I have to say it's a bit of an unusual experience to be speaking in a conference room where I can literally hear an echo in the background. I'm at a baseball stadium singing the national anthem. So I'm here to give you a slightly different perspective along with a grand total of 5 to 6 minutes on carbon capture and sequestration. So as you might expect, this will be at a fairly high level. First of all, indulge me with a brief plug for the reason I'm here is, of course, my employer. I teach at the University of Houston Law Center, but I'm also working with a new center that we've set up on carbon management and energy. It's specifically dedicated to investigating integrated strategies to help reduce carbon emissions in energy production. And I wanted to specifically let all of you know it's there. It's fairly new, so we're still getting the word out. You have the great opportunity to visit with our executive director, Chuck McConnell. Chuck, if you'll wave your hand, please. All right. And also, in addition, we are having a workshop next week on 45Q and its role in financing carbon transactions. So again, harass Chuck if you have questions about that. So with that, let me then begin with saying that I come to you, I think, as the first lawyer today on all the speakers, which gives me a little bit of a slightly different perspective. I'm an environmental lawyer, which means I have spent a lot of time dealing with NGOs and environmental groups, as well as other academicians, on the challenges of carbon capture, utilization, sequestration. And I just have to stress to you, we need to remember we're talking amongst ourselves, that we need to keep in mind that there is an incredible degree of skepticism about carbon capture and utilization, particularly in the context of EOR. Just last week, I was talking with someone who quit the board of directors of a national environmental group because they're going to come out in favor of some form of carbon capture without specifically condemning EOR. So keep in mind, this is not a done deal. This is not something that we just assume everyone's going to sign on to. So with that small peppering of perhaps pessimism and a little bit of a jaundiced perspective, now let me switch on you and say it's no doubt, no matter how you look at it, CCUS is indispensable. It's been said a couple of different times already this morning and during our lunch presentation, none of the strategies we're talking about are going to work unless we have CCUS. Right now, we already have around 17 projects, according to the OGCI latest annual report, that are already testing out some of this technology. Some of you may already be familiar with the Petronova facility down over in Sugar Land that's also doing it at a power plant scale. Having said that, we've got so much more to go. We need to increase our sequestration by a factor of 25 before we even get anywhere close to the reductions that will be needed to attain the 2-degree scenarios that we're shooting for with the Paris Accords. We're not even close to developing either the technology or the scale that we're going to need to do this. In addition, that's just CO2. I won't talk as much about methane, but the truth is any CCUS portfolio we're talking about is going to have to also talk about how to capture and either safely dispose of or reuse methane as well. So with that in mind, besides just the physical reality of attaining the targets, again, as a lawyer, have to bring slightly darker news. There are other drivers that will increase the need for us to have CCUS. In particular, many of you may recall that the ill-fated Clean Power Plan, which has now been, technically mired in litigation still the DC Circuit, but effectively has been withdrawn and replaced with the Affordable Clean Energy Regulation, specifically targeted reducing CO2 emissions in the coal-fired power or fossil-powered sector. What you look at closely at the standards they've adopted, it expressly contemplated widespread integration and use of CCUS. And that is just a harbinger of the future. If there's a change of administration, if there's a change in the technology availability that will change the standards of compliance for permitting purposes, if CO2 is either re-permitted as a pollutant on the federal level or is permitted on the state level, you're going to expect to see CCUS appearing not as an option, not as an economic alternative, but as something that you need to look at as part of your compliance strategies for operating large-scale oil and gas operations or power plants. So with that cheerful news, I won't even talk about climate change liability lawsuits, which I'll be glad to talk with anyone about over a cup of coffee during the break, probably for more than you want. So with that in mind, where do we go? Let me begin by saying CCUS is an indispensable first step. And I think, interestingly enough, as part of setting up the Center on Carbon Management and Energy, it's been striking to me the uniformity of every single company we've talked to, that they understand this and they are committed to figuring it out and integrating it as part of a larger suite of approaches to make sure they understand the way to operate and preserve their business model in a carbon-constrained future. But it's only the first step. Let's face it, CCUS is at best a transitional strategy if all it does is minimize the footprint of current emissions. The end of the day is ultimately, when you start thinking about CCUS as part of ultimately negative emissions control and strategies. That would include some other types of negative emissions technologies or direct air capture, such as we talked about this morning in regards to with Oxy's investment in both carbon engineering as well as its investments in net power. So with that in mind, that means we need to start rethinking, looking ahead as to what our strategies will be going forward in the future. For example, talking about enhanced oil recovery in conjunction with CCS needs to begin building the case very clearly with strong data that it is net negative, including the entire life cycle of the oil that's produced and consumed by that process. That data is being assembled, but frankly is inconsistent and not, I think, in an integrated fashion may present in a way that's going to persuade skeptics. Remember where I started my presentation, where we're actually seeing pretty heartfelt dissension on national boards of organizations. Without that data, we're not going to be able to get that type of acceptance of CCUS as a strategy to deal with this. Second, we're going to need to think about how to integrate CCUS as part of an integrated systemic approach to reducing carbon emissions in energy production. At the center, we are developing a research plan which is looking at how to integrate modular technologies at each step of the production chain, including not only wellhead production and transport and storage, but also refining and chemical production, terminaling and distribution and consumption. You're going to need to have an array of technologies that will build on CCUS to be able to make a persuasive case that the emissions are under control for the entire sector. And in addition to that, we're going to need to make a case for federal legislation to make CCUS financially viable, technologically achievable, and desirable from the societal viewpoint. I'm sure many of you in the room are aware of the Use It legislation, which has been reintroduced this session. It's going to make a very clear roadmap on how to permit and authorize and finance the infrastructure we're going to need for carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. That bill is probably one of the few environmental bills in this session that actually has bipartisan support and actually made significant progress last session. It has, I think, promising prospects for this one. And so last, and normally here I would try and put up a slide from our center talking about what we're doing and longer range plans, but instead I'll just wave my hands and hopefully that will suffice for everybody. I'd like to suggest that perhaps some of the best ways to think about carbon capture and utilization and sequestration is to think about it not as a capture and technology issue, but as a design problem. Just like negawatts, which Jeanne-Mey has talked about in the past, is a very powerful conceptual tool, we're really talking about essentially megatons, designing systems so you don't emit them in the first place, so that in a way you remove the need to sequester them after the generation. So one of the things we've been looking at, for example, is talking with different folks in regards to the center for redefining the refining process to make it zero emission. And it turns out that there are actual suites of technologies that have been considered that are available now, which if you start integrating them into the cycle for turnaround, could potentially get us a long way towards that pathway. We need to be thinking about how to integrate renewable energies in terms of energy production as well as management. If some of you may be aware, of course, some of the work's being done right now in the North Sea and with production off of Norway's coast, where they're integrating wind power and essentially an offshore electrical grid specifically driven by renewable that will support offshore oil production. That reduces the carbon intensity not only of the oil itself, but builds the technology for the capture and the sequestration that's oftentimes may be difficult to do on its own without that binary partnership. So with that, I will pause and pass the baton on to my colleague here to my side, and I will not make any kind of disparaging remarks about the competition between our two schools within the campus.
You could, and if you could pull the slides back up, please. We're going to go back to the slides. Greg has a few slides. Greg Bean has a few slides on hydrogen.
They're in the front, aren't they?
Yeah, in front of hers, exactly. Yep.
There you go.
Okay, so I want to talk briefly about the role of hydrogen in decarbonization of the economy and potentially its impacts in Houston. I know that perhaps for some people, the idea of hydrogen's role in this transition is relatively new or less understood. But hydrogen, in fact, as a clean fuel, has been thought of for almost 150 years, going back to Jules Verne, the famous quote from The Magic Island, and Jules Verne talking about how water and hydrogen and oxygen could eventually replace coal as an energy source. I think it's helpful to just provide a small amount of background on hydrogen. The potential uses of hydrogen in a low-carbon economy are fundamentally based on its unique properties. It's the most abundant, lightest, and smallest element. Its combustion is clean. It produces only heat and water. It has a very high specific energy content by weight, which is important when you think about its potential role as an energy carrier or storage medium. It can also be both produced by electricity and can produce electricity. And some of the applications that we could see do that. And finally, and we've talked a lot about this already, low carbon hydrogen can also be prepared from existing hydrogen production methods when you're adding carbon capture. So we have a hydrogen industry today. Its biggest segment is in the greater Gulf Coast. A couple of interesting things about hydrogen which I think point us in some directions in the future. One, about half of all the hydrogen in the world today is produced from natural gas. So the importance of natural gas as a feedstock for low hydrogen production for us here on the Gulf Coast is important. And second, about 90% of the current consumption of hydrogen is related to refining and chemical industry. So we here in Houston, as the center of the refining and chemical industry, are well positioned to advance the role of hydrogen. When you think about some of the needs that we have with respect to transitioning to a low carbon world, hydrogen can potentially have a role. Hydrogen can be a continuous source of low carbon heat and electricity. Something that is important to think about is that there's a huge trade in global energy today, and almost all of it is in fossil fuels. And hydrogen and compounds derived from hydrogen can be important carriers to enable the long-distance transport of clean energy. Similarly, in storage, about 25% of the global demand and energy in all types today is held in storage. So there are huge storage needs that are not going to go away. And again, today, most of that is held in fossil fuels as well. Hydrogen, because of its physical properties, can also be a potentially significant clean energy storage medium. Transportation fuels, transporting large, heavy payloads over long distances can be quite favorable for hydrogen, given the trade-off that you have of power and stored energy weight versus range. Industrial fuels and feedstocks, these are things that we're thinking a lot about here with respect to petrochemicals and refining in the emissions chart that Richard showed earlier. But on a more national and global level, industries like steel, cement, and ammonia are huge emitters of greenhouse gases, and hydrogen can potentially replace fossil fuel in many of those applications in terms of high quality, high temperature process heat, but also in some processes like in steel production, direct ion reduction of steel. And finally, we've talked a lot about carbon capture and utilization. Hydrogen can be an enabler to some types of CO2 utilization. As we capture carbon, CO2 from fossil fuels, it creates those opportunities to do something with CO2, and hydrogen can facilitate some of those conversions to C1 chemicals and potentially even to some synfuels. So as we think about the role of hydrogen in decarbonizing the industry and the economy, really Houston should be at the forefront of expanding hydrogen's role. When you think about today, we have a huge advantage. We have a huge industrial base. We have the largest existing infrastructure of hydrogen production, network of storage pipelines and storage facilities, and we have proximate to us very large supplies of natural gas, which can be important with respect to the first opportunity here. So as we think about the role of hydrogen and decarbonizing, our industrial sector and Houston in general, I think we have to remember that, we are not only a producer of fuel products and chemical products, but a significant exporter to both the rest of the country and the world. So the opportunities for us are not just to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the production facilities, but potentially to produce newer, lower carbon fuels that we can export. Opportunities include a short-term and medium-term, blue hydrogen, producing hydrogen from existing stream reforming plants with carbon capture, eventually maybe green hydrogen, producing it from renewable electrolysis plants. Something that in the short term is viable, blending hydrogens with existing fuel systems, using it in existing power plants. And Jeanne-Mey talked about in the future, we'll have the ability to have turbines that run 100% on hydrogen, provide high temperature process heat for the industries here. And something which I think is worth us thinking a lot more about is new production and export facilities for hydrogen carriers. That could be ammonia, that could be other liquid organic hydrogen carriers where you can hydrogenate the carrier, it can be transported using today's fuel infrastructure at ambient temperature and pressure, and then the hydrogen can be extracted at the other end. This could be a big opportunity for us here in Houston. And then finally, where there's need for fast fueling opportunities for fleets that have return to base components, there's an opportunity for us, if we have a large hydrogen production infrastructure, to locate some of those fueling facilities close to those.
Thank you, Greg. So how are we doing on time, Brett? 5? Okay. So quick question for each of you. If you could recommend to this audience or thought leaders around Houston one thing that should be done to advance this whole initiative going forward towards a deep decarbonization future, what would you say is the most highest impact thing that could be done now?
Sure, I'll start. We talked before this, and as I said, we've set ourselves on the surface of it, a very ambitious goal, but actually it's what's needed to meet the climate change goals set globally. So I think we should, as a city, set ourselves a goal that is aligned with what is needed to meet those climate change requirements. And then the second thing, and I know you only asked for one, but
Go ahead.
the second thing is that we absolutely need to come together and have a very structured plan, a thought-out plan, and enact some of the suggestions that both that all of the panelists have suggested. We really need to come together and do that, because right now I think there's a lot of groups working in isolation with some coordination, but it's not really coordinated. And as the energy capital of the world, we really need to be the clean energy capital of the world. And as has been strongly suggested, we have that capability in the city to do that.
Great, thank you. Cate?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the goal. Always important to have a goal. It is also very important to have data that tells you that you're making progress on your goal.
Sure.
So, I mean, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? That's the old saying, right? So I would certainly encourage operators here to make sure they know what they're dealing with and what's realistic for them to achieve.
Very good, thank you. Tracy?
One thing. I'd say that there needs to be a visible commitment to make clear that Houston is the capital for energy, but also the management of carbon and other climate-related issues attendant on energy. The truth is, if you get outside of Harris County, we're viewed as the fossil fuel energy capital. And we're taking big steps forward to address that. The City of Houston Climate Action Plan is a nice way to start raising that profile. Each of the companies, I think, are taking steps to make sure that they understand, but in terms of integrating them into a picture of Houston that shows where we plan to be in 15, 20, 50 years, that needs to be put together in a way that's accessible and that could be presented to people outside of Houston. So
do you view it more as an issue to kind of help communicate what Houston is to the rest of the world, or do you see that?
It's not just a PR issue, it's also an integration issue. Right now we have a lot of different efforts bumping along with each other, but in the sense of actually integrating them into a coherent roadmap and a vision of what Houston can be, this conference is a good, huge step towards that direction. We need to start putting that vision together, because otherwise we're constantly going to be explaining to people that we're not what they think we are, we're actually something different.
Right.
Greg?
And I think you were asking, is it both is it external or internal? It's
Yeah,
both. I think that's really.
I was
it's
wondering
both.
if the audience for that also needs to be Houstonians and people who live in this area, as well as how people view it outside of Harris County.
Oh, absolutely.
Greg?
Yeah, I think that a goal or target that's widely understood is helpful. I think it would be interesting to think of that kind of goal as something that's just beyond what are the emissions that our plants produce, because I think Houston can really be at the leading edge of increasing the production of low carbon energy products, and we ought to be able to track that and get some credit for that. So to the extent that we are exporting LNG, which is replacing coal someplace, or we are exporting ammonia or other hydrogen carriers that are allowing hydrogen to be consumed in importing countries, displacing high carbon fuels there. It's a complicated calculation, but I think the impact that we could have could be much greater than just measuring the emission levels at our plants today.
I heard goal mentioned, I think, uniformly here. Do you have any thoughts, or I mean, you mentioned explicitly, Greg, not just emission reductions, and I think that's a great point, but with respect to emission reductions, do you have a sense of what a goal that would be stretched but accepted or acceptable by many would be for the Houston area?
I really don't. I really don't.
Anyone have any
maybe
perspectives
perhaps some
on
of
that?
the other panelists have thought more about it.
I can't speak to acceptability. As I said, when we set our goal, we aligned it with the global goal of the Paris Accord. So if that is what scientists are saying is needed, meaning to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius of post-industrial temperature rise, then I think we ought to set that goal. And there's many pathways, as we've talked about, there's many pathways to achieve that goal. And that's where the real work is actually in mapping out those pathways and how they are relevant for Houston. And I agree with the point that we need to not only track what we're doing within our borders, but the effect that what we're doing has outside the city and the country as well.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's really key to sort of start from that end goal of the 1.5 degrees, right? I mean, I think that many of you all may have heard of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which sort of helps companies and cities think through what that realistic goal might be to get you there. And that would be something for Houston to consider.
I think we might have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. No? We don't?
Those you can't see him back, he's going like this.
You know where these people,
That was a pretty
you know what they look like, you know where they're going to be. I think we'll all be at the reception, most of us will be anyway. So I'd like to extend my appreciation to our panelists. Thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.